this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
During the Second World War, the United States produced a number of remarkable battlefield commanders, men who rose through the ranks to lead in some of the conflict's toughest campaigns. Among them was General Lucian K. Truscott, known for his aggressive leadership, sharp tactical mind and care for his men. Truscott commanded at Sicily, Anzio and later in southern France and Germany. Despite his record, he remains one of the lesser-known American generals of the war. To tell us more about Truscott, his career, character and contribution to victory, I'm joined by Glyn Harper. Glyn is an emeritus professor of war studies at Massey University in New Zealand and the author of General Lucian K. Truscott, A Quiet Talent for Fighting. Thanks for joining me. Shall we start by sketching out Truscott's early life in Texas and Oklahoma, I think, isn't it? What kind of family did he come from? What's his background?
Yeah. Rural United States, born in Texas, but spent a lot of time in Oklahoma and started his career as a teacher. His family were quite impoverished. There was a family scandal with his father being a doctor who had become addicted to laudanum. So basically his practice wound up every few years when people found out that he had this this habit. So the family had to keep moving on. And to support the family, he left school at the age of 16 and became a school teacher in backwater areas of Oklahoma until there was an opportunity in 1917 to actually join the army through a backdoor entry for commissioned officers. In 1916, 1917, the US was having some problems on the Mexican border with Bandas La Pancho Villa, and they were aware that there's a war in Europe they may get involved in, so they needed to expand their army rapidly, and one way to do that was to have a short, sharp commissioning course for officers, which they could offer a temporary commission. And that's how Truscott became an army officer, because he lacked the funds or connections to get to West Point, which was his dream. So he had a backdoor entry because of the war and the problems on the Mexican border. Joined the cavalry, which he'd always romanticized about, and really had regular cavalry postings up until the Second World War, with a couple of breaks for his military education at the Cavalry School at Fort Riley and also the Command and Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, and he became an instructor at both of those schools as well.
It seems, for someone who's not necessarily been to West Point, quite a good interwar, because he doesn't fight in the First World War, does he? Misses out being deployed.
He misses the First World War. He wanted that opportunity for combat experience, but the cavalry regiment he was in was not sent. In fact, few cavalry regiments were. He spent most of the First World War on the border of Texas and Mexico, then had a posting to Hawaii where he took up the sport of polo and became a very good polo player. And believe it or not, polo was actually critical to his military career, because he came across the likes of Patton and others who played polo. We could mix on the same same level as these West Pointers. And he also got his first appointment in the Second World War due to his prowess at polo, because he was sent off to Mountbatten's headquarters. The combined headquarters at Mountbatten was running for commandos and so forth, and planning the Dieppe Operation Jubilee. And he was picked because of his skill at polo, because apparently Mountbatten was crazy about polo as well and had actually written a book on how to play it. So they thought that might break the ice with Mountbatten. Just a strange thing, really.
I'd never made that connection with polo, because the British Army is riddled with polo playing officers as well. Lingua franca for the Allied forces is the polo pitch.
Yes, it seemed to be. Well, as I say, it was immensely important to him. The other important factor in his military career, which sets him up, is his relationship with Eisenhower. Eisenhower, as a colonel, had arranged the biggest peacetime military maneuvers just before the Second World War first off in the state of Washington and California, and then the Louisiana maneuvers. And Truscott had been sent there as his 2IC, basically, to help him run those maneuvers. And Eisenhower was very impressed with Truscott, saw him as a quiet achiever, somebody who got on and did those tasks. And when they were looking for somebody to go to Mountbatten's headquarters to learn about combined operations and also this new organization called Commandos, he selected Truscott. George Marshall, the chief of staff of the army, who basically kept a black book of promising officers and so forth, did not have Truscott in his book, and he didn't think Eisenhower got it right, because before he went over to the United Kingdom, Truscott went to Washington and he started reading about amphibious operations, even though he'd only been in a small boat twice in his life and was a cavalry officer. He started reading up about it, and his final interview was with Marshall, and said to him basically, I think you're a little too old for this. I was looking for somebody much younger. He didn't smile once during the whole interview, which kind of threw Truscott off his game a little bit. And at the end of it, Marshall was still questioning whether Truscott was the man, and actually fronted Eisenhower and said, "You sure he's the person for the job?" Eisenhower backed him, and Marshall backed Eisenhower's judgment. And the rest is history, as they say, because Marshall would certainly change his mind about Truscott later on.
He'd also served under Patton in the interwar years as well, so those connections have been made. Have I got that right?
They had come in touch with each other during a posting in Washington, D.C., and Patton had been the executive officer of a regiment that he'd served in. But their most closest connection was as polo players, because they both had a similar style. They were both really aggressive, use of profane language, and so on. So yes, they did know each other well, and they had served together. But yeah, this polo field does explain a lot, I guess.
There's an interesting paper there. Polo in the interwar military and connections made. So he is sent to Britain. What is he actually tasked with when he's sent to Britain? Had America entered the war when he's sent to Britain at this point, or is it just before?
This is after Pearl Harbor, so this is early 42. He's sent to Britain. He's tasked basically with being a senior staff officer on Mountbatten's headquarters, and he's to go there to learn all he can about planning amphibious operations, and also to look at this new organisation called Commando units and see whether that would suit the American style. Also, he is there to try and get American Army officers exposed to combat in some shape or form, so they can gain some experience. So primarily, he's there to learn as a staff officer about amphibious ops and also the commandos, and to try and get some Americans combat experience. And in that role, he's initially sent there as a colonel, but he is promoted to brigadier once he arrives in the United Kingdom, which he said made a hell of a difference. He did learn a lot. He studied all he could about amphibious operations, particularly the planning for Dieppe and Operation Torch, in which he would take part in both of those operations. He looked at the commandos and thought they were a great asset to have for an army, and he wrote a paper for Marshall recommending that they establish similar units, but to call them rangers instead of commanders. And he thought commandos was a specifically British word, and the Americans needed a catchy title of their own for those units. So he comes up with Rangers. He appoints William Orlando Darby to command to raise the 1st Ranger Battalion, and eventually during the war 7 Ranger Battalions are raised and used. Unfortunately, they suffer a disaster at Anzio, but I can talk about that a little bit later on.
We'll get there. So he is there for Dieppe, isn't he? He was just an observer.
He was. He's not on Mountbatten's headquarters very long, because one of the people he has to brief on amphibious ops, particularly Dieppe and Torch, is Patton, who recognises that Truscott is probably being wasted as a staff officer, and he would like him under command once again, and so he seizes him. But he is there for Dieppe on a British destroyer of the Fernie as an observer. He managed to get involvement of some Rangers, some 4 officers and 44 men, so that they get their first taste of combat. And he's actually the first US Army general under fire in the European theatre of war. because, the destroyer design actually comes under fire and a shell hits it and wounds and kills some sailors, and he's involved in nurturing the wounded on the way back to the United Kingdom. So he's there for Dieppe, and as we recognise now, Dieppe was an absolute disaster, which probably only revealed how not to do amphibious operations rather than any positive lessons that came from it. But Truscott never thought it was a failure. He thought it was a costly lesson, something we had to do to be able to learn how to go about carrying out amphibious operations, of which he would be involved in several more over the course of his military career.
So when he is planning Torch, do we know what he's adding or taking away to Torch from his experiences at Dieppe? What lessons had he learned that he's passing to Patton for that planning?
He learns quite a bit from Torch, particularly, and something that always stuck with him was the need to actually plan it carefully and train for it, and also carry out rehearsals, if possible, on a beach that would look something similar to the beach that was going to be landed on. He's also aware, too, that Mountbatten's headquarters is quite unpopular with the other services, and that there needs to be some way to break down these inter-service rivalries. And one thing that he recognises and learns and adopts of his own is that he tries to appoint as many liaison-type staff officers to headquarters that are planning amphibious ops. And these are things that he recommends to Patton, because Patton is going to be involved in Operation Torch as one of the senior commanders, and Truscott will serve under him in that role.
I think that's one of their biggest learning curves, essentially, is that North Africa campaign when it happens, how to work with one another.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And Operation Torch, the Americans were very confident that would succeed, and Patton was particularly adamant that once they got there, everything would fall into place and things would go swimmingly well, that he didn't need as much preparation and rehearsals as Truscott was recommending. And of course, with Operation Torch, it was a successful amphibious landing, but things went drastically wrong, and particularly so with Patton's landing on his Western Task Force.
They did actually achieve what they were trying to do. He lands at Casablanca, isn't it, the Pattons?
He has the Western Task Force with three major objectives, Safed, Casablanca, and Port Lauti, which is further north, which was Truscott's responsibility. They did succeed, but at a much slower rate than they anticipated. The objectives were taken, but days after they anticipated getting them. Also, the Vichy French did put up some stern resistance in places, which was not expected as much as possible. And had they been facing German defenders who were well trained, they would have suffered even more. They were fortunate, I think, that the Vichy French, some of them put up a fight, some of them didn't, and the resistance was rather haphazard and sporadic rather than organised, and they were lucky in many cases to get away with it.
They're impressed with him enough. He gets a division for Sicily, doesn't he, in command, again under Patton. I wonder when he gets in charge of a division, does he look and think, well, this is going to be the Truscott model, this is how I'm going to run things? Does he make it his?
Yeah, absolutely. He's very fortunate in that despite the problems that went wrong with his landing, and there were many, they did take their objectives, and both Eisenhower and Patton were impressed enough to recommend him for promotion. So he was promoted to Major General and given command of a very good infantry division, the 3rd Infantry Division. And you're absolutely right. He's a cavalry officer now in charge of an infantry division, and he has his ideas about how things should be done and could be better. But he waits for a while. He's not a bull in a china shop type of commander. He looks, he observes, he gets to know some officers, and then he basically, brings down his rules, his model for how they should be doing things. And a couple of important things that he does is he changes their rate of combat marching or marching combat loaded, and he thought they moved far too slowly, slower than Roman legions, he actually said, and much slower than commandos and rangers, and he wanted the same rate of march that a commando or ranger would do adopted to his infantry. So instead of marching the slow 2 miles an hour combat loaded, they would march 5 miles per hour in the first hour, 4 miles an hour for the next 20 miles, and then 3.5 miles an hour for another 30 if they needed. And it was a very fast pace. It was combat loaded, and that becomes known as the Truscott Trot. He also insists on hard, realistic training. And he insists too that the entire division go through the new Amphibious Warfare Training Centre, which has been established in North Africa, run by Brigadier O'Daniel, known as Iron Mike, for his approach to training. And he puts the entire division through it. So by the time they get to Sicily, they have adapted this new combat march. Their physical fitness is superb, and they've been through an amphibious warfare training school, and they've done a series of rehearsals, are ready to go. In fact, some have said the rehearsals were much harder than the actual landing itself. He stamps his authority on this 3rd Division, and he changes it from a very good division into an exceptional one, probably the best in the army at that time.
And did they see a lot of action in Sicily? Are they seen as being reliable and Patton? Does he lean on them?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They land around a place called Licata. They're supposed to be playing a secondary role, but they take so much ground that Patton finally gets authority to direct them onto Palermo, which is one of the big cities on Sicily. And the Truscott trot, as Patton says, got us here in a hell of a hurry. They get there in a couple of days when they're expecting to get there in weeks. But then, of course, Patton wants some more glory and directs them onto the town of Messina on the eastern coast. And he wants to take that town before Montgomery gets there. And that leads him to a clash with Truscott, who's in task with carrying out another amphibious operation really, really quickly, and one that had little chance of success.
Truscott does push back against Patton, doesn't he? He doesn't just take it.
Yeah, he's never a yes man. In some ways, it was a misunderstanding. Truscott's directed to do this amphibious landing at Brolo, near Mount Cupola, to outflank the German lines that are holding them up. He gets the order in the late morning and basically asks for another day to organise it, because he wants to make sure it's got reinforcements are available and there's more artillery that can support the infantry that land. Truscott asks for permission through the Corps Commander, who's Omar Bradley, who stars also on the rise, and Bradley approves. Bradley never thought this operation was worthwhile. He thought it was foolhardy and Patton chasing vainglory, so it readily gave him this day's approval. But when Patton's chief of staff informed him that Truscott didn't want to do it and had requested a delay, Patton was furious and phoned up Truscott, told him to get on with it, and then that wasn't enough. He stormed into his headquarters and basically started tearing strips off Truscott. And there's a famous conversation that they have. Patton telling him, first off, Patton says, "What's wrong with you, Truscott? Are you afraid to fight?" And Truscott says, "General, that's insulting and ridiculous. You know we'll do it." And then they go on, Patton says, "You're far too old an athlete to know that you can't postpone a game." And Truscott fires back, "But sometimes games are postponed." Anyway, at the end of it, Patton is told the operation is going ahead as he ordered, and Truscott will carry it out even though he disagrees with it. And after that, his anger evaporates, and they go off and have a drink. And Patton writes in his diary at the end of it, "May have been a bit too hasty, but the operation went ahead, and I have to say it didn't succeed." And over 100 of the infantry involved from the 3rd Division became casualties in this operation, which really probably owed much to Patton's desire to get to Messina rather than for any sound tactical reason.
Did that affect what Truscott thought of Patton and his working relationship with him, or did he accept that it was Patton's job sometimes to push?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. No, you think it would. It certainly affected Omar Bradley's relationship with Patton, but not Truscott. Truscott remained an admirer of Patton for the rest of his life. And Truscott said in an interview in 1959, "I enjoyed serving under Patton. He was a very fair man." So they established a very positive relationship. And while Patton was a little bit envious of Truscott's rise during his period of disgrace, the second time that Patton was relieved of command for basically saying Nazis were the same as Democrats and Republicans back in the United States, so an unacceptable statement to make to the press, so he was relieved of command second time. And Patton's actually asked, "Who do you think should replace you?" And he recommends, he said instantly it should be Lucian Truscott. He's the man for the job. The two men actually established a fairly positive relationship, and also Truscott spoke at Patton's funeral, because Patton's killed in that road accident in December 1945. He read the eulogy at Patton's funeral. So the two men remain close despite that little incident on Sicily.
It shows a remarkable sort of self-confidence from Truscott's point of view that he can go back at Patton, who is way above him, but at the same time not feel that he's been done, he's not feel belittled or resentful. He appreciates this is a working relationship. So many people would have taken umbrage and then held that grudge for a long time. But it's just saying as a no, you've got a job, I've got a job, we've thrashed it out. Okay.
Yeah.
Move on.
Yeah, and got on with it. Yeah, no, Truscott was very much like that. He was never a yes man and always expressed his opinion. But once that was expressed and a command decision was made, he would fall in line with it. His next commander in Italy, Mark Clark, who he didn't get on with. The most famous incident of that is after Anzio, when the instructions from Alexander are to cut the junction town of Valmontone and trap a German retreating army. And, of course, Clark countermands that order and tells him to go for Rome. Truscott protested that order in every way, shape and form that he knew, but once it was established that Clark wasn't going to change his mind, he followed that order through, but he always thought that was a wrong order, and actually wrote about that in his book, said he thought it was the wrong decision, but he's the general, I've explained what I think should happen, but he's given me an order and I follow through with that. So, absolutely. He would do that, express his viewpoint, but he'd get on with the job once the decision was made.
What was his management style like with his division? How is he commanding them? You've got people sitting in bunkers, or have you got sort of a Rommel style at the front and disappearing for days on end?
How was he commanding them? Always a frontline commander. Could get out and about, be seen by the troops, and talk to young officers, drive them if necessary. And there are many accounts of him being at the front line, rapping on a tank, for example, or sitting still and ordering the tank to get forward and do some damage. And he also insisted on briefings, regular 8 a.m. briefings to know what was going on. His staff, I have to say, loved him, and they stayed with him throughout the war, and he would take the best staff as he moved forward. The men of the 3rd Division revered him as their commander. I should make a point too, he actually selected the division song, the Dog-Faced Soldier. He thought it was a great song, great marching tune, and great for morale, and that became the divisional song, and it still remains the 3rd Division's song, the Dog-Faced Soldier. Well, his style was, I guess, forceful, leaving no doubt what he wanted, but also getting out there, prepared to take the risk, making sure things were happening, getting out of the way of people doing their job. Basically, a very effective style of command that people reacted to. In fact, Eisenhower, in a statement to Marshall just before the 3rd Division goes in Sicily, says, Patton has this quiet, forceful personality which subordinates instinctively follow. A kind of really effective command style, and different from other US commanders of the time.
So he's in Italy under Clark next, and they were initially told they weren't going to be used for Salerno. I think they do get committed, and they do see heavy fighting, but then they get sent to Anzio, which is his 3rd landing, amphibious landing. Or is his 4th?
Fourth if you do count the 2 in Sicily. So you've got you've got Dieppe, you've got Torch, you've got 2 in Sicily. So it's his 5th landing, number 5. Yeah,
which is really remarkable for planning that. This time he's under General Lucas. How does it go for 3rd Division at Anzio? Does he have it? Is there any friction between him and Lucas? How do the two men get on?
No, the two men got on really well. It's kind of tricky because Truscott could see Lucas's failings as a commander, but also respected him because Lucas always backed Truscott, always listened to him, and Truscott realised that Lucas had problems with Mark Clark as a commander, ordering him to do things which were sometimes impossible. But Lucas and Truscott had a really good relationship, and Truscott was very reluctant to take over 6th Corps at Anzio from Lucas when he's given that job. And Clark says to him, look, I need to relieve Johnny Lucas. I'm going to do it in such a way that he's not hurt, so he'll be relieved without prejudice. And Truscott, always speaks his mind, says to Clark, you cannot relieve a commander without hurting him. Truscott and Lucas retained a good relationship even after Truscott's taken over from him, but Lucas never forgot or forgave Mark Clark from relieving him of command at Anzio.
Anzio is possibly Truscott's finest hour, certainly from a historical public history point of view. But what does he achieve there that Lucas was struggling to do?
Well, first off, he becomes a highly visible commander. Lucas seldom went forward and inspected frontline positions and was basically headquarters bound, seldom left his headquarters. So that's the first thing. He gets out and he is a thoroughly visible commander. The second thing he does is he improves relationships with the British, because the British had lost faith in Lucas and they had been pushing for his relief, which eventually happened. So of the frontline units that Truscott visited, he made sure he visited the British formations, particularly the 1st Division, and all their forward battalions and units. And he also brings in a British staff officer as a liaison to let him know when things aren't going well and to advise on what should happen. So he moves forward, frontline commander. He's improves relationship with the British. He also improves the defensive position. He institutes a combined and coordinated artillery plan so that the guns can fire as one on any target that they identify. He improved defensive positions, particularly around the port for the hospitals and the gun positions. He moves his headquarters above ground, so he's not seen to be sheltering in a wine cellar where the previous headquarters were, and basically improved the position so that they could resist any German counterattacks that came. So he really transformed the situation, and he also plans several counterattacks and plans 4 ways to break out of Anzio. So basically, he transforms the position from them looking over their shoulders and worried about whether the enclave would survive to basically making sure that it would and actually moving them into offensive-minded position. So it is his finest hour, and he does transform the situation at Anzio.
Yeah, it's slightly curious that this being his finest hour is at Anzio. Then you've always mentioned his disagreement with Mark Clark over Rome. He disagreed with taking Rome. Yeah, considering how well he's really sort of done, Clark doesn't seem to rate him, scores him quite badly on his efficiency report, 7 out of 20 and 20 out of 200, 250 something. Clark really has a downer on him.
He does, yeah. Clark doesn't like him. Well, they don't like each other. That's a fact of life. Clark in his diary is always constantly complains about Truscott whining all the time. Look, he wants this, he wants that. He asks for things I can't give him. And he writes he's a very difficult subordinate to handle. And Clark is probably right. I mean, Truscott always spoke his mind, and Truscott was not one to accept that he had to do things on a shoestring budget if it was going to cause casualties and so forth. He wanted to give his men the best opportunity to succeed, and he would push for that. And Clark found Truscott's, honesty and willing to go the extra mile for his men a bit disconcerting. He doesn't just follow orders, which is what Clark wanted people to do. He doesn't make me look good, and he doesn't give me the credit. That's what Clark wants. For his part, Truscott recognised that Clark had certain qualities of a general, particularly his ability with logistics and that he was a courageous general. But he writes, and he actually writes this to his wife, he's one of the most self-centered individuals I've ever met. And the other thing that Truscott really despised about Clark was his constant need for publicity. He had to be where the cameras were. If there was an article written about the Fifth Army, it had to mention Mark Clark 3 times on the first page and call it Mark Clark's Fifth Army. And he just found Clark vainglorious, a publicity hound and self-centered, despite the fact that he did have some qualities of a general, which he would admit to. But they didn't get on. In some ways, they're complete opposites.
Well, it makes you wonder if he was really, because he's sent to do Operation Dragoon. Is he an army commander for Dragoon?
No, corps commander. He's a 6th commander.
He's corps commander. He comes back as the army.
Yes, he does.
Whilst it's probably stressful to do yet another amphibious landing, it might have been a relief for him to get away from Clark.
I think it was. And And just jumping ahead, when Marshall asks him at the end of Dragoon whether he'd like to go back to Italy, he basically says, "No, I don't." And there are a couple of reasons for that, and one of them is Mark Clark, I have to say. Yeah, I think when he's pulled out of the Italian campaign with 6th Corps and becomes part of Sandy Patch's 7th Army, it's a relief because he found Patch a really good army commander to work with.
Someone else who you don't hear as much about because he's not chasing publicity.
No, absolutely. He's another one like Truscott who's in the background, very effective, very, very efficient at what he does, but virtually gets very little publicity. What Truscott liked about Patch was that Patch let him run his own corps. If he explained to Sandy Patch what he wanted and what his plans were, and Patch approved it, he would say, "Look, go ahead." And one of the things that he wanted to do was that because he always had trouble with Clark about this, he said, "Look, once the amphibious landing's on the way, I want to run my own show. I want to control the beachhead once it's landed." Patch said, "Yeah, go ahead and do that. I'll support you in any way that I can, but just get on with the job." And Truscott loved that. He just loved the opportunity to have a bit of freedom of action and to do the job that was given him in his way.
But Dragoon was very much a success for him, wasn't it? I don't think there's any major hiccups there at all.
Dragoon and what follows, the advance up the Rhone Valley to the frontiers of Germany is very, very successful. The only thing against Truscott is that he only has 3 divisions and very little armour, and while he would have liked to have captured and destroyed the German army in front of him, the German 19th Army, they're unable to do that, although they severely maul it, so much so that it's not an effective fighting force anymore once they reach the German frontier. So his performance in Dragoon and what follows is outstanding.
Perhaps the problem is he's now the slave to his own success because he then gets sent back. Because there's a shuffle round, so Clark becomes this is where Alex goes up, Jumbo Wilson. Well, you tell me.
Yeah. Well, it's the equivalent of military musical chairs, really. Well. First off, Truscott is promoted on the recommendation of Franklin Delano Roosevelt to the Senate, so he becomes a lieutenant general. Eisenhower doesn't want a corps commander to be a lieutenant general because they all want to be lieutenant general. So he pulls Truscott out and gives him an inactive command, the 15th Army, which is basically a training and admin organisation. Much to Truscott's disgust, and he tries to refuse the promotion, but Eisenhower said that's not possible. So he's given this command. Before he starts it, he's also given a couple of weeks' leave in the United States. He goes back, meets up with his family, and of course visits all the senior military officers. But while he is in the United States, the senior military officer in the United States dies and needs to be replaced. So he's replaced by Field Marshal Wilson from Mediterranean Theatre.
Dill dies, doesn't he?
Yeah, Dill dies. Yep, yes, Sir John Dill dies. And so his replacement is Wilson from Mediterranean Theatre. So Alexander is bumped up to Wilson's position. Mark Clark is bumped up to Alexander's position, so he becomes the group commander, the army group commander, which leaves the command of 5th Army vacant. And this is when Marshall asks Truscott, "How do you feel about going back to Italy?" And of course, Truscott thinks, "Oh dear, Mark Clark, another Italian winter in that mud and slush. No, I don't." And of course, his beloved 3rd Division is now fighting in France. So he says to him, "Oh no," Marshall pushes him because he gives a standard answer. "I'll go where I'm needed." But he's pushed by Marshall, and he said, "No, look, I don't want to go back to Italy. I'd much prefer to serve with Eisenhower in France and see the war out there." But guess what? He's going back to Italy, mainly because the person who's bumped up to become the theatre commander, Mediterranean theatre commander, Alexander, specifically asked for him, and Churchill also wanted him. So Churchill raised it with the FDR, and that meant Truscott's fate was sealed. He was going back to spend the last months of the war in the Italian campaign commanding the 5th Army.
Clark had tried to get his own man in, hadn't he? He'd put his own person, Keys, forward.
Yeah. He would prefer one of the corps commanders, Geoffrey Keyes. He had singled him out, and When it was raised about going back to take the Fifth Army, Truscott had to point out that both the corps commanders in Fifth Army, Keyes and Crittenberger, were senior to him. In fact, I think one of them had been his instructor at his officer training course. So, they got quite senior to him. But that didn't cut with Marshall. He said they'll do what they're told, and they did. And Truscott sent back to the Fifth Army, and so he's got a command of over 200,000 men and many units, U.S. divisions, including the 92nd Buffalo Division. The 10th Mountain Division comes in and joins them. There's a South African Armoured Division, and there's also a Brazilian division in his army. So it's quite a polyglot organisation, and he commands it for their final offensive, which is actually one of the best offensives in Italy of the Second World War.
Well, I was going to say, how did that go for him? Because Clark actually, by the end of the war, has him as his top general, doesn't he? Which suggests potential thawing of the relationship. Well,
it does, because as an army commander, Truscott basically calls the shots in that army, and Clark, while he has two armies under commanders, is more removed from the actual battlefield. And of course, the other thing that happens is that Truscott delivers Clark immense success, makes him look good, and provides many photo opportunities, particularly when the Germans surrender in early May 1945. So Clark is now very happy with Truscott. Truscott still is suspicious of Clark, but manages to get on with him and get the job done. And you're quite right, Clark now has a completely different view of Truscott because he's making him look very good.
Yeah, I never thought of that. Once Clark's at a different level, he's bumping heads with Truscott on different things that are potentially less aggravating for him.
Absolutely, yeah.
I never thought of it that way around. So Memorial Day 45 at the cemetery gives an extraordinary speech to the fallen rather than the living. Do you want to tell us about that? Because that's quite moving.
It is very moving, and I rate it as the second finest hour. This is a big occasion. There are congressmen and women from the United States. There are senior officers in the front row. There are Italian politicians and others. And rather than speak to them, Truscott actually turned his back on them and spoke to the recently dead in the cemetery. And he basically said something like, "I'm sorry you're here. If you're here because of any mistake I've made, I hope you can forgive me, but I know that's asking a hell of a lot, because there's no glory in getting killed at such a young age, and if anybody speaks of glory in war in future, I'll sort them out. I'll remind them what war is really like." And I have to say, that really moved the audience. One of the witnesses there, Bill Malden, American cartoonist in the 45th Division, basically said it was the most moving speech he had ever seen at a memorial service ever. His aide wrote in the diary at that time, General gives a speech and surpasses himself as usual. I thought that was a really good comment.
Good, we're going to take a moment. Folks, we'll be back after this short break. At the end of the war, how does he compare with the other generals in terms of his reputation amongst his men and amongst his peers?
His men always rated him highly, particularly the men in the 3rd Division. I actually had somebody send me an email a couple of days ago saying, "Oh, my father served in the 3rd Division. He absolutely loved Truscott, thought he could do no wrong. Didn't like Lucas though, for some reason." But so he was revered. He doesn't have a great reputation amongst, high-ranking military generals of the Second World War. He's one of these forgotten generals in many ways, rated highly by people who knew him. Eisenhower thought he was the second best army commander after Patton. Alexander basically called it, he said he was dynamite, just absolutely phenomenal, but also noted that Truscott was a bit shy in a crowd, like he didn't push himself forward, which is probably one of the reasons he doesn't have this established reputation. There are a couple of others I could talk about as well. And Marshall rated him highly at the end of the war. He'd kind of been somewhat dismissive of him early in 42 when he got this first appointment, but recognised what a great commander that Truscott had become. And I have to say, Truscott has a unique reputation in the Second World War in that he commands at many levels. He commands a regimental combat team, he commands a division, he commands a corps, and a very big corps at Anzio. In fact, it's got 6 divisions. It's the size of a small army, 150,000 men. And then he commands the 5th Army. And at each level he went, I reckon he got better and better. He was efficient and effective. And the higher he went, the better he became.
Yeah, they never managed to find his ceiling to promote him beyond. And it must be extraordinary. There can't be many commanding at that level in the American Army who hadn't been to West Point or those military academies.
Very few. Although George Marshall was one of them, he didn't go to West Point either. He went to VMI, the Virginia Military.
Did Patton go to VMI as well?
Yeah, Patton went to VMI, then went to West Point, and always got in trouble at West Point because he'd tell people VMI was stricter. So, Patton always seemed to get in trouble when he spoke.
Because I wonder as well, if you think about his reputation today, if part of it is he's under Patton, who takes a lot of the glory and eclipses everything. And then he's under Clark, who at the time went out of his way to steal all the glory.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think there are 2 really important reasons why he's not well known. One is that he was adverse to publicity and always avoided it whenever possible. He had many photo opportunities of generals he'd captured or generals surrendering to him, and he always ignored them, and pushed them away. So he didn't blow his own trumpet and promote himself. That's one reason. The second reason is that he always served in secondary operations or secondary theatres of war. The Italian campaign, the Americans never wanted to do it to start with, and once Rome was captured, they tended to lose interest, and their main focus was in France, and of course they wanted to do Operation Dragoon as well. And Dragoon was the second amphibious operation in France, and it's always been overshadowed by Overlord, what Winston Churchill called the tyranny of Overlord. It overshadowed everything else. And Truscott himself said, and I don't think it bothered him, but he acknowledged that in 1959 in that interview, that when you come second, you're always forgotten. And in some ways, it's true. I mean, you look at the moon landings, for example. Nearly everybody can tell you who the astronauts on Apollo 11 were, the 3 astronauts. Nobody could tell you who the astronauts on Apollo 12 were.
Well, that is a good point. Glyn, thanks for joining me. It's been great to talk, and your book, General Lucian K. Truscott, A Quiet Talent for Fighting, is an excellent read for anyone interested in one of America's most capable but often overlooked commanders of the Second World War. Now, if you have enjoyed the show, just a quick reminder, it's only me here behind the microphone. I do all the research, recording and editing myself. Listener support really does make a difference. Becoming a patron helps keep the podcast going, and you'll get ad-free listening along with bonus excerpts from interviews that don't make it into the main episodes. You can find out more at patreon.com/WW2 Podcast. Well, that's all for this episode. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.